Well, welcome. It's a tricky passage, isn't it? Daniel 1 to 6 that Duncan introduced us to last week is such a great read, really accessible stories. Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel eating vegetarian food, and all of this stuff. And then suddenly you hit chapter 7. Stephanie kindly read for us. And it's weird. What's it all about, and why is it so weird? Well, I want to suggest to you that these latter chapters, these last 6 chapters, the second half of Daniel, is just highly, highly relevant to the world we find ourselves in today. So let's have a go at understanding it and doing a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through chapters 7 to 12. What about all these beasts? What's going on here? So first of all, as soon as you hit chapter 7, the language changes. The first 6 chapters have been in the language Aramaic, which most people around the Middle East would understand at the time. And now we hit Hebrew, which is the language specific to Israel, which many, many fewer would understand. So we're kind of getting much more in-house language. And not just in-house language, but quite difficult language, full of figurative speech. Why? It's very simple. You're talking about the empire. You're talking about your oppressors. You're talking about God's justice and God's judgment. And you don't particularly want outsiders to readily understand what you're saying, but you do want insiders to understand it. So you use a kind of code language. And that's what we have, code language. So the average Babylonian or Greek or whatever tries to read Daniel, and they hit chapter 7 and think, oh, what's happened here? Language has changed. And they stagger on because they do understand a little bit of Hebrew because they're a scholar. And they think, what on earth is all this? And by the time they've got to verse 18, as we did today, they've probably given up thinking, I don't know, these Jews, they're strange people. But as soon as the text continues, we quickly discover there's an interpretation of what's going on. And we discover these 4 beasts we've been reading about: the lion, the bear, the leopard, and another animal which perhaps looks a bit like an elephant. Quickly explained, these are about the empires. Several weeks back, David Blower referred forward to this particular chapter and how one empire comes and it goes, and another empire comes and it goes, and God actually judges every one of them. And they're depicted by these beasts, the lion, the bear. They all have different characteristics. The lion's strong and ferocious. The bear's perhaps seems a little bit cuddly, although maybe not as cuddly as you might think. And at the end of the day, they're all beasts. They're all animals. And whilst you can expect animals to behave like animals, when human beings create like animals, we call them beasts. And we have a word for it. We say they're beastly. And that, at the end of the day, is what all these empires are. They are beastly, for better or for worse. So it's about the way God is in control of humanity. He's not surprised by any of this. And each empire he bats away in judgment as it comes and it goes. In chapter 8, so let me just say, the lesson, as Duncan was giving us a foretaste of last week, God is in control. None of this is a surprise to God. God is in control of human history. Here we're getting a heaven's eye view, whereas in the first 6 chapters we've got kind of a worm's eye view from Daniel, right in the midst of empire from his own perspective. Now we're getting this heaven's eye view. But as we hit chapter 8, the story goes on, and with a different set of animals pops up, but it's just saying the same thing in a different way. In fact, it keeps saying the same thing in a different way. And then we hit this particular ruler. And I'm going to read to you from chapter 8. Particular ruler whom anyone living in the 2nd century BC would recognize by the lead up to it and what's happening. Says, he will be a fierce-looking ruler, a master of intrigue. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Things have got worse. It's bad enough living under empire, but when a particular empire comes and desecrates your temple, sacrifices a pig on it, trashes everything that you hold dear in your culture and your ritual life, he trashes it all, and he just treats you abominably. And the temptation is to say enough is enough. You know, when individuals watch on video a man having the life squeezed out of him by a brutal policeman who's meant to be representative of the powers that be and the ruler of the country, and you watch the life being squeezed out of him, it's tempting to say, let's riot, let's hit back, let's fight against these evil powers. That was the temptation right then. Indeed, it's what happened. And if you look at the books of the Maccabees and the record of the Maccabean revolution, that's exactly what happened. In the end, people took up arms against him. But let's think about what's been happening in these first 6 chapters of Daniel. See, in the past, when Israel had sought to fight against evil, they always did it in the same way. They went out to war against the idolatrous nations who represented all sorts of things that they saw as bad. In the early days, it was very much a sense of there being a just war, of fighting against the enemies of Yahweh, fighting against people who sacrificed children, who did all sorts of horrific things. When the monarchy came, unfortunately, Israel began to look more and more like just the nations around them. And it was just, they were going to war, and it was all a bit samey, really. They just looked like every other empire. It's just that this one happened to be done in the name of Yahweh, but they worshipped idols. They had all sorts of corrupt practices. They didn't take care of the poor. They didn't do any of the distinctive things that Israel was supposed to be doing. And God allowing the exile was very much turns out to be for Israel's good. They suddenly discover, and Daniel discovers, a different way of fighting evil. And it's the power of no. I'm terribly sorry, Your Imperial Majesty, but I just can't do that. I can't bow down and worship as you ask me to. I'm terribly sorry, Your Imperial Majesty, but I can't eat this food sacrificed to idols. As Duncan was telling us last week, we have to choose our battles carefully. But once chosen, the power of saying no is tremendously powerful. And Daniel, of course, was ready to go to his death for saying no. As Martin Luther King was ready to go to his death for saying no to an increasingly corrupt government and hypocritical government. Rosa Parks was ready to take the consequences when the government said no and she said yes to riding on a bus that was supposed to be a whites-only bus. And look at the impact that her yes to the government's no could have through that gentle decision to say yes to the government's no or no to the government's yes. But the temptation is to take up arms, and the answer here in chapter 8 is, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. So we've already seen the commendation of non-violent resistance, the simple act of saying no to the government's yes, or vice versa. But the chapters 9 and 10 go on to give us a more specific answer to this, because Daniel is horrified by what happens and he prays. And what we read in chapter 10 is the explanation as to why his prayer hasn't been answered for a while. And there's this story about how as soon as he prays, God dispatches Michael to sort out the empires of the world and all of this evil. But he gets interrupted, and for 21 days he is held up. And it's a mystery. We don't understand it, but what we can grasp from this is that sometimes God cannot, in good conscience and according to his own principles, he cannot just root up evil. Sometimes evil needs space to play itself out. But what Daniel did do was he prayed. And what God did do was he answered as soon as he possibly could. As soon as he could. It only took 21 days. And then he was on it. He was on to the answer. So the first lesson is that God is in control. The second lesson is that God invites us to change the world through our prayers. Here is a way that we can join in the heavenly perspective. And when the people of God pray, things change. But the third thing, and we've already alluded to there in chapter 8, and as we move on to chapter 11, we sort of wind back out to the same place. Again, we hear this very detailed explanation in chapter 11 of what's going on in world affairs, what's going on with this evil king that they were encountering in the 2nd century there. And you get all this detail, and despite the fact that God wants us to know that he's in control, and despite the fact that we can participate through prayer, he recognises that when you're going through it, it doesn't feel good. He recognises, he understands the detail, he understands the pain of living under the brutish force of empire. He understands, he empathises with us in all of the detail and in all of the pain. The black people who have suffered racial prejudice for so long, he empathises with them in the pain. The detail is where we live and move and have our being, and God understands it. And finally we get to chapter 12. A remarkable place to finish for this book. I'm going to read it to you. At that time, it says, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish such as never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky. And those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Comment on the wise. To be wise is to treat the rules with care and discretion, to know what's important and what's not. To be wise is to know when to collaborate with the empires of this world and when to resist. To be wise is to recognise what is truly important and what is peripheral. And to lead many to righteousness is to care more about transformation than retribution, to be ready to participate in changing the world through our yes to the power of the ruling classes' no, and vice versa. This is the first time in the Bible that we get a solid glimpse of resurrection. That this is not just something for this life, but it's something for eternity.